All right, so let's get into education. I want to talk about that a little bit. It's an interesting time to be alive in America. Regardless of what people feel about the new administration, Trump's administration, there's going to be a lot of changes, and whether we like them or not, they're going to happen, right? So, one of the things I want to talk about is he's made some new appointments the past couple of days, but one of the appointments I want to talk about is Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. They are the new heads of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOG, DOGE. One of the things they want to tackle first is dismantling or getting rid of the Department of Education. It sounds like scary stuff to a lot of people. The Department of Education has been around. The U.S. Department of Education has been around. I don't know, maybe over 4 or 5 decades now, right? So before we jump off out the window and say this is some far right wing stuff going on, I want to play this video as he talks about the problems with the Department of Education.
I go back to this question of mission, right? A lot of people who make arguments for the Department of Education aren't aware why the Department of Education was created in the first place, actually. So that might be a useful place to start, is that this thing was created. It had a purpose. What was that purpose? It's interesting how eager people are to skip over that question and just to talk about, okay, but we got the status quo and it's just going to be disruptive, versus asking the question of, okay, this institution was created. It had an original purpose. Is that purpose still relevant? Is this organization at all fulfilling that purpose today? To me, those are some relevant questions to ask. So let's talk about that for the Department of Education. Its purpose was relevant at that time, which was to make sure that localities, and particularly states, were not siphoning dollars, taxpayer dollars, away from predominantly black school districts to predominantly white ones. And that was not a theoretical concern at the time. It was happening, or there was at least some evidence that was happening in certain states in the South. And so you may say you don't like the federal solution. You may say you like the federal solution, but like it or not, that was the original purpose of the U.S. Department of Education, to make sure that from a federal perspective, states were not systematically disadvantaging black school districts over predominantly white ones. However noble and relevant that purpose may have been 6 decades ago, it's not a relevant purpose today. There's no evidence today of states intentionally mapping out which are the black versus white school districts and siphoning money in one direction versus another.
We got to be honest with ourselves. We as a society are dumber than what we used to be. You know what I mean? Because, we have our smartphones, we have our tablets, we have our phones. They can answer any question. We got AI. You pick up your thing and you Google it. It'll translate other languages. But we as a society are stupider. Let's be honest with ourselves. About 40% of U.S. students read below the proficiency level. So that's almost half, and it's pretty scary. And it's not just because the pandemic. I mean, this is a problem that was there prior to the pandemic. In addition to that, so in 2022, they actually did a survey, and they were able to see, or a study showed that 70% of eighth graders were still reading below the proficiency level. 70% of eighth graders, right? Now, when you look at that, you got to say to yourselves, I know it seems scary to look at a Department of Education, or a big department in the government, and say, you know what, let's get rid of them. But it's something to think about, because it's really about, what are the results? What's happening? Why do we have the results we have? So a conversation about why we have the results that we have, I think, is important.
So Department of Education funding, so federal funding, accounts for about, I'm giving you round numbers here, but around 10% of the funding of most public schools across the country. But that comes with strings attached. So in today's Department of Education, this didn't happen back in 1970, but it's happening today. Ironically, it's funny how these things change with the bureaucracies that fail. They blow smoke to cover up for their own failures. What happens with today's Department of Education? They effectively say you don't get that funding unless you adopt certain goals deemed at achieving racial or gender equity goals. I don't think it's the federal government's job to withhold funding from a school because they include something in their curriculum that the federal government deems inappropriate, where that locality found that to be a relevant locus of education. So what you see then is an abandonment of the original purpose that's long past. You don't have this problem that the Department of Education was originally formed to solve, of siphoning money from black school districts to white school districts and laundering that effectively in public funds. That doesn't exist anymore. So they find new purposes instead, creating a lot more damage along the way.
It's the difference between a task force and an agency, right? So if the Department of Education was set up to do a particular thing and it solved those things, then it is time to move on and then also look at the metrics of where things are going, whether they're going good or going bad. And I think that's the biggest difference in this administration. I think a lot of people are scared of just doing something different. I talked to a lot of people who, who did not vote for Trump, and there's, obviously the whole hatred of him personally from a lot of voters, half of America roughly. But the question is, what are people scared of? And I think a lot of what people are scared of is just doing something different, doing changing direction. Some of these agencies have been around for 50 plus years, and it is time. I think with his appointment, him and Elon's appointment for the Department of Efficiency or Government Efficiency, I think the whole thing about auditing the government, taking a look at these legacy agencies and see if they're still relevant to today, I don't think it's a crazy thing. I think it's really something when it comes to education. There's many things wrong with the public education, not just at the federal level, but at other levels, as I said. But I think it is time to start looking at things differently.
So if we get government out of education, would you be also for reducing the size of government in the states for something like
I think
education?
here, if it goes closer to municipalities and to states, I'm fine with that being a locus for people determining, as for example, let's just say school districts are taxed at the local level, for that to be a matter for municipalities and townships to actually decide democratically how they actually want that governed, whether it's balance between a public school district versus making that same money available to families in the form of vouchers or other forms of ability to educational savings accounts or whichever mechanism it is to opt out of that. If that's done locally, I'll have views on that tend to go further in the direction of true educational choice and diversity of choice, the implementation of charter schools, the granting of state charters, or even lowering the barriers to granting one. I favor those kinds of policies. But if we've gotten the federal government out of it, that's achieved 75% of what I think we need to achieve, that I'm focused on solving other problems and leave that to the states and municipalities to cover from there.
So given this conversation, what do you think of Elon's proposal of the Department of Government Efficiency in the Trump administration, or really any administration?
Well, I'm of course biased because Elon and I have discussed that for the better part of the last year and a half. And so I think it's a great idea. It's something that's very consistent with the core premise of my presidential candidacy. I got to know him as I was running for U.S. president in a couple of events that he came to, and then we built a friendship after that. So obviously, I think it's a great idea.
Who do you think is more hardcore on the cutting, you or Elon?
Well, I think Elon's pretty hardcore. I said 75% of the federal bureaucrats, and while I was running for president, he said you need to put at least 75%. So I agree with him.
So many people have lost their mind since Trump has won, and this whole concept of thinning or reducing the size of government really has a lot of people scared. And when you think about the common everyday person, the reality is the government is paid from tax dollars. They don't make money, they just tax, right? So I wonder why people are so worried about the idea of reducing the size of the government at the end of the day. Because again, your daily lives are mainly affected by the municipality you live in the state. A lot of what you have going on, for instance, I tell people all the time, if you look at what's going on in the states, there's small microcosms of how things are run nationally. So when you look at, let's say, a state like Texas, Texas is growing. They're going to outpace California soon because people want to move there, right? They have lower taxes, right? They have less regulatory for business, right? They have better weather than a lot of places up north, right? So they have that going for them. And, it's a better quality of life for some people. And some of it's based on how Texas as a state is ran, right? So when you look at other places like Oakland, San Francisco, New York City, Chicago, they're too expensive to live in. A hell of a lot of regulatory when you talk about business, when you're trying to do business. And that's what changes the makeup of states. So I say all that to say that getting rid of or thinning down the government is not necessarily a bad thing that people should be worried about, because ultimately, if there is a lot of waste in the government, To have an administration that's willing to actually look at it and thin it out means they're actually working for the American people. They're thinking about the American taxpayer. So a lot of people say, "Oh, well, the Republicans and the conservatives, they just want to hurt the poor people." But my thought is that what hurts the poor people is having a bunch of people in government who are wasting money, who aren't necessarily helping. So, this is something good to talk about. But as far as education, I think there's going to be a big change. And I think something different needs to be done anyway. So we're going to see what happens. But I just wanted to drop some perspective as far as the Department of Education and this new task force with Vivek and Elon. So let's see how it goes. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Is it a good idea to get rid of the Department of Education, or is it not? Let me know what you think in the comments. Crucial Combo.